I've never done this before, but I'm going to do something quite unusual. I'm going to tell you all a dream I had the night before last. I know hearing other people's dreams can be really, really boring, but it just feels kind of significant to me. I dreamt I was at my old home in South Africa, the home I left 33 years ago. And it's kind of strange because it actually kind of belonged to Anton Harber, who was the editor of the Mail and Guardian newspaper in South Africa, who I did a lot of work for in the 80s and 90s. I was in this house, and there was this kind of apocalyptic feeling rainstorm. There was this kind of rain, and it was just coming down the windows. It was rain like I'd never experienced before. And I kind of had this idea of, to maybe try and it's obviously climate change, so I was wanting to photograph just the rain coming down, just to kind of photograph out of the window. And I had stuff in the kind of bedroom, but there was this sort of big sitting room, and it was like I was at Glastonbury, and I had way too much stuff, kind of tents and stuff and chairs, and all my kind of Glastonbury stuff was there on the floor. And there was immense rainfall, and I said to someone, I think this could be a flood. And then the water began kind of coming up from the floor. There was kind of water coming up all over my stuff, and I couldn't find my camera. There was this kind of classic anxiety dream thing. I was in the middle of a flood, and my camera had been mislaid. I couldn't find it, and I was shouting at the people there, "Please help me!" I was begging, "Please help me find my camera." And I had the sense somewhere that the back room was somehow safe and things were there, but the water was rising amongst all my kind of Glastonbury stuff. And there was this real sense of panic, and I didn't know where my camera was, and was it getting wet, and should I be photographing, could I be photographing? And then sort of suddenly saw my camera was like on a low tripod leaning against the far wall, and then the alarm bell, the alarm rang, and I kind of woke up. So that was my kind of classic kind of flood anxiety dream. But I think maybe we're kind of living in a world where it's becoming kind of one climate change anxiety dream, and that's something which, I think many people have that kind of thing. So I'm going to take you through my work on fire and flood and show you some new things, show you some old things, and what I really want to talk about is the kind of the different ways I've kind of the work has mutated and changed, and kind of these different narrative threads have emerged and become entangled. So I'll take you through all the various kind of narrative threads which I think are kind of working. Some have been failures and haven't worked, and some have kind of come together. So I'm going to take you both through flood and fire, because these are the main engagements. And I began working on flooding in 2007 at a point when I had young children, and I did the exercise of trying to imagine the life they'd be leading when they were my age, and began to kind of research the kind of imaging of climate change. And at that point, it felt there were lots of areas, lots of images out there of glaciers and polar bears, like in color, physically just very, very white, distant images. And I really felt there was a need for something visceral, something which was about the people affected by climate change. And so I began, so over the years, I photographed in, flooding in 13 different countries. And this image is from Brazil. And you'll see later on in another kind of thread, a series I called the flood lines, where I got a bit obsessed with windows and doors. So I was actually on a boat photographing this doorway. When the owner, and this was in Rio Branco in Brazil, when the owner of the house kind of came edging his way along the wall. He had come back to his house to see what was going on, and he kind of demanded to be in the photograph as well. And unusually this picture is not centralized, and it was shot from a boat, because normally I'm kind of standing at the same level as people. But in this part of Rio Branco, which often had flooding. The water had risen higher than ever before. It had been above the rooftops. And the house was actually built on stilts, so if I'd tried to be in the water, there would have been about 4 meters beneath me, so I had to be on a boat for this picture. But I'll take you through some of the series, the Submerged Portraits, which, if I can get this right, was shot in, it began in the UK in 2007, where I shot floods in India shortly after photographing in the UK, and got this sense of a shared vulnerability across the world. Just a crossover with arte, which is really interesting, is I've done a lot of work in Bayelsa State in Nigeria, which is an interesting kind of coincidence for me, because I feel a very strong connection with that particular part of Nigeria. Where I've actually been there in 2012 and last year. So this is a very recent picture shot in close to Yenagoa in Bayelsa. So we've probably been walking down the same streets. Yeah, and this is, Terence McKean and his mother in Florida in 2017. And you can see Terence is kind of quite a tough guy, but I was sort of, I joined him and his mother were on a boat going to her home where he'd been staying as well. And he got off the boat and got into the house, and I was actually filming him, and he just began howling. He just broke down in tears. And his mother Gloria was on the boat, and I was kind of arranging. You can see the nature of the portraits I do, which are quite constructed. Position people. We were, and Terence. I spoke to Terence about where to photograph him, and this actually was the garage. He'd actually, at that moment, he was estranged from his wife, and he was living in this garage when the flood kind of happened, and we were going to. I was walking with him to do a picture, and his mother and Gloria from the boat said that actually she wants to be in the picture as well. So although she was 70 and pretty old, she came down into the water and was very game, and we took this picture. But you can see Terence really was had just been crying, and so this is a recent picture from Pakistan. I've also been to Pakistan twice. I did the floods there in 2010 and the floods there last year. I'll take you through the series. Yes. I'm obscuring. Okay, sure. And actually, what I wanted to say as well is how's that? Okay. It's all going to fall. What I want to say is I'm not a very formal kind of person, and I feel a bit uncomfortable being the kind of lecturer up here on the podium, and I'm really happy to open this up to discussion. We don't have to wait till questions at the end. Feel free to just talk and ask questions while we do. Well, I think I'm not necessarily trying to get anything from people. It's kind of what they present, and there are some moments of kind of emotion. But for me, it's very important that my subjects are kind of empowered and are not kind of victims in the encounter. So it's important that the people. I think there've been a lot of questions for me about the nature of the gaze. Is it an accusing gaze? Is it a questioning gaze? What is the content of their look at the camera? And it changes across the pictures. Sometimes there's kind of resignation, but for me, that's the fundamental kind of question mark. And it's always the kind of, I suppose, the kind of punctum of these photographs is the way their eyes and their kind of, the way they engage with the camera. And yes. Yeah, and I think, and absolutely, but I think the thing is that in a way these are quite conventional portraits. You know, as portraits, they're quite ordinary conventional portraits. It's the environment that's extreme, and kind of the kind of combination of that sort of ordinariness of with this kind of hectic environment is, and you know, this concept wasn't really planned out. You know, it began at a point, you know, in 2007 when it kind of happened. I just got myself a Rolleiflex camera, an old Rolleiflex camera, and I was experimenting with portraiture, and I was also trying to do work on floods. And somehow, you know, I went to some floods in the UK, and something just kind of clicked with doing that. And it just felt like quite a natural thing for the people I was photographing. You know, and I think had I gone in there with my kind of conventional photojournalistic cap on, it would have been a situation where, like, you know, can you do something for the camera? Can you be trying to flee, or can you be trying to gather your things up, or, you know, can you do something I can photograph, as opposed to finding this moment of stillness. And it's probably also an adaptation to the fact that I'm quite slow. I'm not there when the moment of flooding happens. I'm there often sometime after the flood, often when people are returning to their homes, you know, or people are kind of navigating or finding their way around this sort of environment. So it's that kind of thing. And there are, I think each one, the circumstance, you know, there's not a commonality in each one. The circumstance of how we get to be there is different. You know, some pictures involve a pretty hectic, difficult journey. Some are really, really easy. You know, it's, and you know, I mean, when I was working in Pakistan recently, it was the most difficult circumstance I've ever encountered. It was like, you know, it was like 43, 44 degrees. It was like blindingly bright light all day. It was impossible to photograph for most of the day. And I, you know, so for this picture, I saw the location, and this was the owner of what's called a hotel in this part of Pakistan, which is kind of like a restaurant, cafe where food and soft drinks are sold. And the light was, you know, just impossible when I was there. And I realized I could only photograph it just after the sun had set, at dusk. You know, and most of the portraits I made were either at dawn or dusk. And I actually kind of came back 2 days later to try and do a picture. And bear in mind, getting to this location involved like an hour's journey on a boat. You know, so we got back 2 days later, and he wasn't around. But we had his phone number, and you know, so again, like the next day, I got back at this time, and I had the frame in mind. I had the whole, you know, it was kind of, you know, I loved the color, I loved that environment, and he was very keen on being photographed and telling his story. So, you know, we finally made it, and you know, it was shot, you know, just, you know, probably minutes after the sun had set, so the light became usable. And this picture, again with the connection to Bayelsa, is, I think, still my favorite picture in the whole series, and it shows Florence Abram at her home in Igbogeni, which is close to Yanagoa in Bayelsa State. And with these floods, I mean, what happened at this flood is that the really poor people couldn't be photographed because their homes were made out of, you know, kind of wood and kind of and mud and kind of branches, and their homes were washed away. So the people I photographed were relatively middle class. Florence, I mean, the journey to get to her, so I met Florence at a kind of her camp for displaced people, and she said, "Are you sure you want to go to my house?" And we said yes, and it involved like an hour-long, really dangerous trudge through kind of water. You know, I wear waders, and the water was like just coming over the top of my waders. Rutmus, who was my assistant, had my camera bag, like he was holding my camera bag over his head. You know, it was a pretty hectic kind of journey to get to her home. And she's a baker, or she was a baker, and she showed me all her ovens and her mixing. You know, all her kind of equipment was destroyed. She'd employed 20 people in her bakery. There was another network of about 30 people who took her bread on bicycles and sold it around, around the area. So there are a lot of people dependent on her, and that, so it gives you the sense of, what that damage to her infrastructure. So many people had lost their source of income because of this flood. And you can see from her kind of expression, she was like a powerful person. And when I'm photographing in any country around the world, I always take advice from my local fixer assistant about how to engage with people. Do I give them anything? What is appropriate? And Ratmas said, you have to have a standard thing you do with people. You need to give them something for their time, but it shouldn't change. So what we set out with Nigeria was that I gave everyone the equivalent of $30, about £25 for their time and to be interviewed. And a lot of people were in pretty difficult financial circumstances, so it was quite welcome. And I know in terms of conventional photojournalism, that's against the rules. You're not meant to pay people. But I don't, I think I've been evicted from photojournalism a long time ago. So, after, I spent a long time with Florence. I took the picture, interviewed her, and at the end of it, I tried to, give her some money. And, she said, her words were, she said, I'm sorry, I don't want to be rude, but I don't want to take your money. She said, but I want you to show the world what's happened to me. And I think it sort of, what she just articulated for me is kind of what I could do or what I couldn't do. I'm not an NGO. I'm not in a position to help people. But what I offer to the people I photograph is a kind of deep witnessing of what happens to them. So I took a lot from that engagement with Florence. And this is sometimes the most used picture. It's up on the street outside. And I think Florence would be really, really happy with this. Unfortunately, this happened before, it was 2012, before WhatsApp became a thing, because, I've lost touch with her and Ratmas, my assistant, whereas the people I photographed in Nigeria last year, I'm in touch with a lot of them via WhatsApp. And I'm sure you know how these things work in, your experience of working in Nigeria, but when I was photographing in another community, but close to Igbogeni, last year, the word went around that I was sending people pictures. I'd take a photograph and I'd WhatsApp. That night I'd WhatsApp them, a nice kind of a photograph, one of my photographs. And the word went around in the community that I was doing that. So me and my assistant at the time, we were dealing with a queue of people waiting to be photographed. It was kind of, and people were actually sometimes like fighting and getting, who's next, who was in the queue. It was sometimes quite hard to manage. So, continuing with, kind of and you can see there's a sense of kind of something really shared across the world in terms of flooding and in terms of exposure to our climate emergency. Yeah, and the pictures, just to go through the flooding pictures have been taken in the UK, India, Haiti, Pakistan, Thailand, Australia, Nigeria, Germany, Brazil, returning to the UK a few times, India a few times, Bangladesh, the USA, France, where else? Thailand. I think that's the 13 countries. But and I think it's also for me quite significant that I photographed some of the poorest people in the world and some of the wealthiest. And this is shot in a multi-million-dollar house in Texas. Moving on now, showing you I think these portraits, the submerged portraits, are the kind of spine of my work on flooding. But much else has kind of happened as well. So another series, which is very different, is a series which I call Floodlines. And in fact, this picture was taken on my very first day of photographing a flood in 2007. It's the home of John Jackson, who's the postmaster of Tolbar village in Yorkshire. And there's just something about the incongruity of a flood, and we get just remarkable light, but also reflections where there shouldn't be reflections. And I think it's also something disconcerting about seeing something which is normally viewed as a very chaotic situation, photographed in a way which is so so precise. And I have this kind of part of me which wants to always make images which are very, very organized and formal and precise. So you can see, again, some of these from around the world. So this was actually shot, one of the most recent pictures shot in Nigeria last November. And this was actually shot pretty close to here in Somerset in 2014. And back to Nigeria. This is a church. When I photographed the floods in South Carolina, this is I was really struck by the kind of racial divisions that still exist in South Carolina. This was on Martin Luther King Street, in a completely exclusively kind of black community, separated from kind of white communities nearby. It just really felt very similar to apartheid in South Africa, and I was pretty struck by this. So this was a kind of a black church in South Carolina. It's also from the same trip to South Carolina. And so kind of veering off into the kind of, I suppose, sometimes almost completely abstract. And kind of what can happen. I mean, I know there are a couple of people in the audience who've experienced flooding themselves personally. Some people have, in fact, two people have kind of shared that with me this morning. And, there's something hugely traumatic about a flood coming into your house, but it's the months, it's the chaos afterwards, and dealing with the mold and dealing with all the damage that's done. It can take 6 months to a year often to kind of be able to even begin returning to your home. Okay, so this is another series which has emerged, and it's a very different kind of series, and it's a kind of almost an archival project. I've built up a collection of flood-damaged personal photographs, which people who I've encountered them in different ways along the way, and this is actually from Shirley Armitage, who, in fact, I met again very close to here. That's Shirley, who I photographed on the right. And the picture on the left is what she described as an image from her third failed marriage. And you can see she's quite upset and probably much more emotional than most people who I photographed. And actually, the reason she was upset was that myself and my assistant at the time, Jo Hilbert, whose mother is in fact over there, we'd had this whole complicated arrangement to go with Shirley to her home. And when she had left her home, she wasn't expecting it to rise very high, and she had left a box of her photographs and albums on a table. And when we got into the home, the water had knocked the box into the water, and all her precious personal photographs were floating around. So, and that was very upsetting for her. And before we even took the photograph, Jo and I were like splashing around the water, trying to retrieve her pictures and save them. But this has gone into, and I now have an archive of probably more than 3,000 flood damaged photographs. And there's something for me about what the floodwater does to the chemical emulsion of a photograph. I mean, it's both very aesthetic, but it's also very sad. And for me, it speaks of the kind of threat climate change poses to communal memory. And some of the photographs are, by the way, these are just all three, which I've showed are all wedding pictures. But some of the photographs are very much linked to families I've met and photographed. And where I've met the people and seen the people, but some are also completely anonymous. This was one of a number of passport photographs which I fished out of the water. We're on a boat in Srinagar in Kashmir, and about 5 passport photographs kind of from some house floated past us. So they were literally kind of pulled out of the water. So some are very, very connected to people, and some are, very anonymous. And I'll show you one particular connected set of pictures. Okay, so this is Gisela Peach Marks, and one of the more recent trips I did was in 2021. There were huge floods in Germany, in the west of Germany, and I didn't get there when the water was there. I was too late. But Gisela had, you can see she was pretty old. She'd spent 13 hours standing on a ladder in her kitchen. She said in her gardening boots, which I think she means her wellies. She was in her wellies, and she'd been standing on a ladder until the water retreated. Then she just basically walked out of her apartment, and she. I'm working on my own German family history, and I'll tell you more. But she'd been working on gathering the story of her family and her family history, which is a pretty fascinating one. And boxes and boxes of documents and photographs were completely destroyed. And she'd taken some stuff to her house, and I helped her organize, dry out, but also so much stuff had to be thrown away. So these are some of the images from Gisela's kind of archive about her own family and her own personal story. She's also got a pretty interesting kind of personal story in terms of her own history. She'd been in bad relationships with abusive men, but she'd also escaped, and she'd become an animator on a cruise liner for many years of her life. That was a photo shoot which she did with her and her sister, who died of cancer when she was young. And then there was a story of her parents and grandparents. And her father had actually been arrested by the Nazis in 1935 for having a kind of a banned book, an illegal book. And then he'd been released, and then he'd been conscripted as an engineer. He'd been sent to the Russian front to fight, and then he was captured by the Russians. I'll find a picture of her father. Hold on. That's actually her grandfather. That was her mother when she was waiting for the father. Hold on. That's the mother again. Yeah. So that was her father, who had been sent to the Russian front. He'd been captured by the Russians, and was then sent, after the war, was sent to the Gulag, and had spent like 6 years in Siberia. Returned to Germany in kind of the early 50s, back to his wife, who'd been waiting all those years, and had then escaped East Germany for West Germany. It was such a huge family story, and all the documents about that were kind of lost in the flood. So this is some of the material which was retrieved. And you can see this is the kind of installation I worked with Gisela to kind of create, with the photographs, with the color, more contemporary photographs, and the older black and white pictures. And for me, it was a kind of way of telling the story. And the way I kind of arranged this installation is basically the chaos is the more chaotic images are in the center, from black and white. So we kind of moved from the sides to the center in terms of what you could see. So on the so this was the whole collection of photographs which she shared with me. And this is just one of her kind of flood damaged kind of negative rolls. And this is the kind of the way we showed the work in Aachen, close to her home. Very sadly, Gisela passed away just a few weeks ago. So yeah, it's it's I think great for me to kind of show the work. Okay, so I'm moving on. How are we doing with time? half an hour. I'm moving on to my work on fire, and I'll go a bit quicker. So in 2020, I kind of felt it was time to go to the other element, fire, which is a very different kind of thing to photograph than flooding, and presents very different kind of visual challenges. Again, it's global. I've photographed in Australia, Greece, Canada, and the USA, so not as many locations. And you can see these are very different kinds of portraits. So I'm going to go back to show you what I mean. When you're photographing a flood, you've always got a flat plane of water in front of you, which makes it visually, for the photographers here, you can imagine, it makes it visually a much easier place to make a photograph. In a fire, it's such a chaotic environment. And what I figured out, and actually I photographed aftermath of a fire in California in 2018, and the pictures just didn't work for me. And what I figured out I needed to do was create images with absolutely kind of precise lines, and place people incredibly precisely. So, if you just look at that, it's such a chaotic environment. So my subjects are always placed with extreme precision, and it's a very different process. I usually work with my assistant, for half an hour, even before the subject comes into the picture, to work out where they're going to be in the picture. It's also quite a traumatic, it's a very different situation to a flood. It's quite a relatively kind of toxic but traumatic environment for people to go to, so I don't like to keep them there too long. So there's always a different communication, but you can see you see the placing of my subjects is always so very, very careful. And it's also kind of, in some ways, quite different to convent, because it's quite hard to do and quite unusual to do portraiture so wide. So it's kind of wide-angle portraiture. And it's always, I've done many of these, and it's such a random thing about the light and the situation and the environment of what actually is going to work. And some just come together, and it's always a strange thing, because often when I come to a place or community, it's quite hard to find people. And we often work through Facebook or just trying to find people randomly. And for example, when I was in Colorado or Greenville in California, the first few days, I haven't got many subjects, but the moment I photograph a few people and they pass us on to friends and the word goes around, and often I think if people have a good experience of being photographed and like the picture, they tell their friends and their neighbors. So, when I was photographing in Colorado, the start of last year, by my last day, I didn't have enough time for all the people who wanted to be photographed. The next morning, I did the last person on my way to the airport. People often, once they get a sense of what I'm doing and they can see my work on social media, they want to be part of it. And this is Gurjit, who also, it was quite amazing. She was photographed in Colorado, and then she came through to London, and she got involved with a kids project, which I'm working on. So some people really kind of take ownership of the work. And then moving on to the other kind of narratives, this is a series that I call kind of scorched topographies, which are just the aftermath of fire, the landscapes left behind. Yes. I'd love you to, please do. Yeah, well, I think for me it's partly about the environment and the content. In a way, floodwater is right there, but with fires, it's quite important. I felt to show the wider environment and to show more of the environment. But something that happened is I kind of photographed floods until like 2018, 2019. In 2020, I began photographing fires and developed this kind of very kind of formally composed way of doing it. And then I went back to the floods last year. I imported some of that back into the work on flooding. So if you look at some of the more recent flood work, for example, an image like that, you can see that I'm stepping back more and taking more of that kind of environmental sort of approach. So some of the more recent ones are kind of importing some of that, the approach I developed with fires back into the flood work. So it is a different way.
All right. Were these outside the photographer's gallery?
Yes, exactly. So these are, many of these pictures are currently on show outside in quite an amazing display.
I thought they were really powerful, so I wasn't expecting them.
Yeah.
My head's elsewhere, don't pay attention. But they were so powerful, the dignity and the stoicism that you talked about. I actually was very conscious of the people in the pictures, despite the fact that you were very aware of their surroundings.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think as a photographer, you're also very influenced by the technology you use. And up till 2017, I was working on a set of old Rolleiflex cameras. So you get a very particular kind of look from a Rolleiflex camera. And then when I moved, I suppose this was probably one of the first pictures I took when I began working on Fuji GFX digital camera. So you get a different kind of feel, a different effect. I think we often don't talk about the way our kind of tools affect the image, but I think that is something which is very, very. And I loved using Rolleiflex cameras, but they're quite hard to focus, and my eyes are getting worse. And I was finding I was losing so many images, because particularly in low light, and I really wanted to be able to work in low light. So I made that move to digital, which has meant you lose some things. There's something about the magic of film, and I think when your subjects see you working on film and struggling with film and changing film, they give you a lot more space. It makes them feel like it's something special, but at the same time, digital is like so much easier and allows you to know what you've got. It's a boring discussion. We could go on for hours. But so I'm going to go back to where I was taking you through the various other narratives. So the kind of landscapes I was working on, in the aftermath of fire. So I photographed fires in the aftermath of the 2021 fire on Evia Island in Greece, and I became very connected to the landscape. Something about the landscape of that island really touched me, and I returned 2 more times to try kind of follow up and see. So you'll see over here, it's not completely precise, but I did spend a lot of time trying to kind of match the frame. And although you do see the return of the grass and the green, in actual fact, this olive grove, the olive trees are destroyed, and the forest in the background, the trees are all dead. And in fact, I need to go back, because apparently, all of these trees have been removed. So I need to go back and do the kind of third chapter in this. It needs to become a triptych to see that same space now. And you can see just some of the strange things which happen after fires. And again, I think these two have a kind of symmetry. Hold on, what's going on? Symmetry of kind of melted plastic, things of different sorts. And this is just melted aluminium from car wheels. And then just moving to kind of the textures left behind by fires. Again, verging towards the complete abstraction sometimes. And on Evia Island, I was taken by a local. He said to me, "You have to see the nymph." It was hard to find. The nymph is a 2,500-year-old olive tree, which apparently, it took 12 people, kind of holding hands to kind of stand around, which was destroyed by the fire. And I kind of came there, and it just felt like some kind of ecological catastrophe, a huge loss to our shared natural kind of culture. And there was something about the shape of it, and the shape of the kind of remains that really kind of inspired me to keep on going. And across the island, there were probably hundreds of thousands of ancient olive trees, many of them hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And there was something, there's something very special about olive trees. And we talked to an olive tree farmer, they have character and they have, all kinds of things. So I just set about photographing these trees, and it felt it needed a very different kind of treatment. So normally I have lots of depth of field. I went for, just a very narrow depth of field, black and white, shooting them most of them in the portrait frame. So these are just some of the, and they form quite strange human figures. And these are shot digitally and then converted to black and white. And then actually, for a recent exhibition, I made internegs, and we actually printed them using kind of conventional kind of black and white, kind of darkroom technology. And another narrative is being a kind of collector and a sort of archivist of sorts. I've also built up a collection of fire-damaged objects, which take up a lot of space in my basement. It doesn't make me popular in my home. You can see some of them here. And again, for me, it's often a process of figuring out, I have these things, how do I photograph them? And it took me a long time to figure it out. And what I did eventually was to take them into a still life studio and photograph them like kind of forensically with absolutely no background. No shadows, just that they needed to almost, I felt they needed to be kind of floating as if they're kind of objects, as if they are kind of archaeological artifacts of our climate emergency. Sorry, that's lost that one. This is a collection of marbles. In fact, from the home of a scientist in Colorado who, in fact, is a climate change denier. Still. Yeah, exactly. I know. I mean, I was. That was. I lobbed it over to you, waiting for the volley. That was just waiting for the volley. You got it. Someone in the audience had to get that. And then I also met an amazing guy who is a property lawyer who also is a collector of old Nikon cameras. And you can see, so this is his, he had 18 cameras, which were destroyed in this fire in Colorado. And these are some of them. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is give you a premiere. This has never been seen before in public. I've been working on a project. I love developing collaborative projects. I worked in 2013, 10 years ago, I worked with a school in Hackney close to me called Kingsmead School on a photographic project. We did an amazing website called Kingsmead Eyes Speak. We worked with the Year 5 class. We gave the kids cameras to take home, and they produced an amazing document. And it was at the time of something called Creative Partnerships, which was an organization which funded artists to work in schools. It was the very first project which was killed by the Cameron government, which came in. But I've always maintained a connection with that school, and the head teacher, who's now in charge of 3 schools close to me in Hackney. When I had my show at the Photographer's Gallery, she kind of said, wouldn't it be good to do something with the kids? And we developed this project. So it's an engagement with a class of 8 and 9-year-olds, pretty young. Worked with an amazing art facilitator, and we did. There's kind of 3 pieces. This one is the most complete and resolved, which is done with a group of kids who worked on my flood pictures. And you can see it's a really interesting translation. This is derived from the self-portraits we made. And this is not yet complete. This is the fire piece. And I'll show you some of them kind of individually. And we're still going to be adding. There's 3 kids whose work wasn't selected, and we're going to be adding another layer, kind of 3 more at the bottom. But you can see the kind of, and I'll put 2 together to give you a sense of what's going on. I mean, for me, this adds a whole new layer of meaning to the work. And to have it translated by the generation who are, and these kids are acutely aware that they're going to be having to deal with the mess we've made of the world, and they're going to be experiencing it. So I think having their interpretation of my images is well, I think what's significant for me is that the kids in this class, in the school, are many from refugee families. They're from all over the world. In fact, many of the kids are from Pakistan, from families with Pakistan, Nigerian, Turkish, kind of family histories from all over the world. I mean, there are quite a few kids in the class whose families are from Nigeria. So I think it's more finding the world, that diversity. Experience. No, I get that. Sure. I mean, I think that would be pretty interesting. I mean, it's just, I suppose, yeah. That's maybe the thanks for the idea. It's maybe the logical next step of where we need to go. Well, I mean, I have just showed it at Glastonbury, and I mean, I haven't yet showed, but I would love to, perhaps, there's the new reopening kind of V&A kind of Museum of Childhood. That would be a great venue. I mean, I haven't spoken, but I'd love to show this work widely, because I think there's something pretty unique and, in the kind of artistry of this work. Some of them, I really, really love some of them. You can see the... and I think Claire Ward Thornton was the art facilitator I worked with, and she was really good at breaking down the pictures with kids. And she'd first get them to do the figure. There was a separation. We'd have a cut-out figure, and that would go on the back. Just working out the structure of the photographs with the kids and coming to understand them. And then we also, we had quite a few. So this part of the whole funding for this, we're building an installation which is going to go on the wall of the dining room of the school. So it'll be a big... So the first place it's going to show is at the school. So it's going to be part of the school decor and display. I'll show you. Some of these I really, really love. They kind of... And the fire ones and the flood ones are also just very, very different. But I think it wasn't just photographs, because from my kind of subjects, I have a lot of quotes and interviews, so I shared them with the class, so they actually kind of used them as a basis for creative writing. So they, the kids knew about the people. And Gojit, who was in one of the earlier photographs, she came into the school and she spoke to the kids about their experience. The kids came down to the photographer's gallery. We had an amazing kind of night, amazing journey with them. It's actually combined with... the school have got this fund for giving kids experience they wouldn't have before. So we did a trip down to Soho. They went to a Chinese restaurant. We had, pretty... and I love the way Claire has kind of used different materials, used kind of cardboard in these. Do you want to see more? Do you want to do questions? I mean, in the time we've got left, I really also wanted to try and address the theme. Hold on, I got those wrong. The decolonizing the environment theme, which I think the whole concept of decolonizing, coming from South Africa and thinking about my own personal history, is very important to me. Let me show you a few more of these, then I'll broach the subject. Yeah. I mean, do you like these? I mean, 'cause this is the first time I've really actually shown them at a talk. So yeah. So sorry. This is Gurjit, who was amazing in one of the works. Yes, sorry. Sorry. 8 and 9-year-olds. Yeah. No, absolutely. And the kids really developed the kind of attachment to the people in their photographs, and it was great because Gurjit over here, she came into the class and, had a really, the kids were transfixed by her story, and she told the story of the fire and how it happened to her. And I think obviously the kids are quite young to be dealing with quite traumatizing stuff, but they could deal with it, and I think so I feel pretty happy with the project and what it's going to go to. So it hasn't been asked yet, but a question I often get asked is, how does it affect you? How do you deal? Because I'm photographing a lot of trauma. I'm photographing people, and in my kind of life as a photographer, having kind of photographed the struggle in South Africa, having photographed HIV and AIDS, I'm really often dealing with people in very difficult, very traumatized situations, and I often get asked that question, which I've kind of often have struggled to find an answer to. My long-suffering partner, Sarah, when I was talking to her about the kind of that question, she said, well, the answer is obvious. You're just the kind of fucked up person who finds it really easy to connect with strangers in distress and connect very strongly with strangers in distress, but you struggle to connect with the people who are close to you, with your family and your friends. Sarah is the nurse who runs the abortion services at Homerton Hospital, and is a daunting, person whose work is so much more important than mine and gets so little recognition. There are very few prizes for nurses. She got the Daisy Award, which was a little like badge, but nurses are hugely are hugely under-recognized and under-rewarded for what they do. But I've been thinking a lot about my own history as a photographer and why I do what I do, and also why I have the ability to do it. And it goes very much back to my own family history. My parents were both people deeply affected by the Holocaust in Germany. They both escaped before the war. But the traumas of not just the Holocaust, but the 20th century lie heavily on my family. My father, in fact, lost his own father as a child, who died fighting for Germany in the trenches of the Western Front in the First World War. So he lost his father when he was less than a year old, and he lost his mother in the Holocaust after trying to get her out of Germany unsuccessfully when he had escaped to South Africa. And my mother also lost a grandmother and lost a lot of aunts and uncles and relatives in the Holocaust, so that they were hugely affected by that history. They also escaped to South Africa, which involved a sudden reversal of their position in the racial hierarchy, that they went from being, having lived through the 30s in Germany, suddenly arriving in South Africa when they became white South Africans at the top of the racial hierarchy. Despite there being a bit of anti-Semitism in South Africa, they had comfortable lives and they made their kind of own compromises of both being uncomfortable with apartheid but also complicit with it in terms of the lives and the kind of privileges that they lived with and the privileges which I grew up with. So I think my own photography is in some ways very much a response to that, the combination of kind of inheriting as a second generation the kind of Holocaust victimhood, but also the guilt of being a white South African and the unearned privilege of a white South African. But there's another factor, which is also that my parents were, like many, many other people who were so affected by the Holocaust, they did their best to avoid difficulty, that they didn't want to acknowledge anything difficult in lives, that everything had to be positive. So they did their best to kind of almost cut off the world of difficulty and emotion from their children, to often quite ludicrous extents. So I suppose I have my own difficulties of connecting to emotions and to my own emotions, which perhaps gives me the ability to get up day after day and put myself close to other people's trauma. So these are the kind of things I'm coming to understand, and I understand the kind of legacy that I'm sort of working with and passing on to my kids. But then also coming to the issues of decolonization, I think is also understanding my own privilege and the effect of my whiteness on my photography, and particularly the photography I did in South Africa in the kind of 80s and 90s. And, I mean, let me see if I can, hold on. Let me just see if I can find something to, sorry. Okay, let me just pull up here. I was able to kind of photograph, put myself physically very close to kind of police violence, and I was, kind of very anti-apartheid. I was part of a generation of so-called like struggle photographers, but I think because I was able to access the kind of black realities and what people were going, but I was also able to, really, put myself close to the police in situations of violence, which I think a black photographer could never have done, both because of fear of the situation, both because of their own anxiety and fear of being, but also because my white presence was probably much more tolerated than a black presence would have been. So, so I think it's a long journey, and I also think, looking back at a lot of my work on HIV in Africa, often well-intentioned, it's also thinking about how I photograph black bodies, and I didn't at the time give much thought to the power relations, that people, although people gave permission and there was a consenting situation, I was often with organizations who were, delivering help, and it was often perhaps difficult for people to say no when their permission was asked to be photographed. So I think, it's looking back on my archive, looking back in my history, through the lens of decolonization is very important for me, and kind of thinking and coming to understand the power relations which affected my ability to make the photographs that I've taken. That's part of my own kind of journey at the moment. I mean, maybe I'll end with that, and it's actually exactly an hour since I began. You have a video you want to show? Oh yes, sorry, I do have a video I wanted to show. In fact, I have made. How's time? Are people want? Oh, we can talk. Okay, so question. Yeah. Well, no, I mean that is a whole thing. But I think perhaps a lot of photographers. I don't know whether it's the effect of being a photographer or what draws you to photography. But I think a lot of photographers are kind of people who are quite detached and outside, and kind of. And partly, it's an excuse to connect. I mean, for me, or maybe you can argue that it's been a way for me to put myself close to other people's emotions. It's a complicated. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for hours. I mean, so part of what I do is video as well. And actually, as my work has developed, probably more than 50% of what I do is shoot video. I don't try and take documentary photographs, but I'd like to shoot a lot of video in documentary situations. If you bear with me, I mean, shall I show you I'll show you a bit of a video piece, which I'm very proud of, which is called Deluge. It's a 5-channel piece. Um, and I'll take you through. It's 30 minutes, but I'll show you just a little bit of it. And it begins in a very, it reprises some of the kind of narratives of the work. It begins in a very abstract kind of way. And you'll see it kind of very gradually opens out and starts to kind of involve people. And this is shown at lots of museums around the world, but never in the UK. So this is... And you'll see some situations are kind of familiar from my photographs, because you'll see that I'm shooting video and stills at the same time, which is not easy. And with the sound, there's a bit of music, but it's most of it is ambient sound from those same situations. So these bells actually were ringing in one of the frames. And I'm sure you'll see that this is a mission to edit. And I worked with, in fact, with 2 very good video editors. And and it's always driven by the central frame is always the driving frame. And you can see people slowly start to enter in. And I don't often do this, having 5 things happening across all screens, but it's quite strong when you just do things not that often. And then the next step is seeing people in the water. They gradually, and first tentatively, and then with more kind of confidence. You can see just very carefully at first. want to take you forward a bit to. So the next kind of, we go forward to night and day, and then it's sort of. For me, this project is about going home. In the end, it's about returning home, and so this is following people back to their homes. Sorry? Yeah. And Shirley. See, it's a very different kind of storytelling to photographic storytelling. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's always having like 5 screens, and we've done different kinds of installations of it. Yeah, but it needs to be. I mean, it's quite hard to view, but on 5 big screens, it becomes a very like powerful experience. And lots of people who've actually been flooded. One particular show in Philadelphia, there were lots of people from a flood who came to see it, and apparently a lot of children who experienced flooding found it quite helpful. So it kind of keeps on going, it gets more active, people being more. And then kind of goes on to the portraits. Concludes with you'll see the set of portraits, and starting with singles, and moving on to larger groups. And then returning to the and loops totally around to the start. And before you go, I'll show you just a little bit of this video, which I think this is Shipra, who is a sociology student who I photographed, and I went with her to a home, again in Bayelsa State last year, and she was a really amazing woman, and I'd taken her picture, and I was actually about starting to photograph someone else, and then I heard her singing a song, and I invited her to kind of sing the song and be filmed outside her home, and she really embraced the collaboration, and I'll take it in a little bit. So and she sings in the church choir. She's an actor, performer. There's something I just love about the theatricality of what she does.
There will be no more big flood, no more, no more. for many thousand years. No more, no more. For many thousand years, there will be no more big flood. No more, no more. For many thousand years, there will be no more crying. No more, no more. For many thousand years. No more dying, no more sorrow. For many thousand years. No more natural disaster in our land for many thousand years. No more crying, no more suffering for many thousand years. We have suffered so much during the season. No more pain. There will be no more flood again. No more, no more. No more dying for many thousand years. There will be no more waters. No more, no more. No more losing of our properties for many thousand years. All our properties are gone. All our farms are gone. Nowhere to lay our heads. Lord, please help.
Maybe that's a good place to end it. Thank you.